A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, most people think of a commodity as something you can actually drop on your foot. A bar of gold, a barrel of crude oil, or a massive pile of grain in a silo. But if you look at the global markets right now, 98% of what is being traded is basically a digital ghost. It is math pretending to be a bean. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the global commodity trading architecture, and he specifically wants us to look at the world of agricultural futures like soybeans.
It is a perfect time to talk about this, Corn. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and I have been staring at the grain complex all morning because the volatility we are seeing this March is incredible. Most people ignore soybeans until they see the price of beef or tofu go up, but these little beans are the backbone of the global food and fuel systems. With the Strait of Hormuz closure on March 17th causing chaos with fertilizer and energy flows, the invisible supply chain that Daniel is asking about has suddenly become very visible and very expensive.
It is funny how we only notice the plumbing when the pipes burst. But before we get into the current mess in the Middle East and how it is hitting the Midwest, I want to go back. Daniel asked about the origins. I was reading that this is not just some modern Wall Street invention. We're talking about clay tokens in Mesopotamia, right? You mentioned the Chicago Board of Trade, but this whole idea of trading a harvest before it even leaves the ground is not a Midwestern invention, is it?
If you were a farmer and I was a merchant, we would agree today on a price for grain that you would deliver in 3 months. We would bake that agreement into a clay envelope. That envelope was the first futures contract. It was a way to manage the massive risk of the harvest before the harvest even happened. By 1730, the Japanese government officially recognized it as a futures market. It is the ultimate act of coordination. But we should distinguish between the two main flavors of commodities here. You have hard commodities, which are things you mine or extract, like copper, silver, or crude oil. Then you have soft commodities, which are things you grow or ranch, like coffee, sugar, wheat, and our star of the day, soybeans. The real leap into what we recognize as a modern exchange happened with the softs in Japan.
So it was originally a tool for stability, a way to smooth out the boom and bust cycles of agriculture. But it feels like it has evolved into something much more abstract. Wait, 1730? That is decades before the United States was even a country. Why rice in Japan? Because I think a lot of people hear paper trading, and they just think of a stock market simulator for beginners.
They introduced what they called rice tickets. These were standardized contracts for future delivery. What made it revolutionary was that these tickets became a form of currency themselves. People were trading the tickets back and forth without any intention of ever touching a bag of rice. It was the birth of the secondary market. If you are a physical trader, you are dealing with silos, moisture content, and railcar logistics. If you are a paper trader, you are dealing with the Chicago Board of Trade or the Dalian Commodity Exchange in China. You are trading the price movement and the risk. For an individual, though, paper trading usually means using a simulator with virtual funds to learn the ropes. The mechanics are the same, though. That is the essence of it. In the West, we saw this formalize with the Chicago Board of Trade, or the CBOT, in 1848. Chicago was the natural hub because all the grain from the Midwest was flowing through there to get to the East Coast. But the quality was all over the place. One farmer might have great corn, and the next might have moldy corn.
That leverage is exactly why it attracts so much attention, but it also sounds like a recipe for disaster if you do not know what you are doing. You are essentially controlling 10 times more value than you actually have in the bank. Why would an individual want to step into that arena instead of just sticking to the S&P 500?
There are a few major motivations. First, diversification. Agricultural markets often move independently of the broader stock market. If the tech sector is crashing but there is a drought in Brazil, soybean prices might soar. 1936 was the official debut of soybeans on the CBOT. Since then, they have become one of the most liquid and important markets in the world. But Daniel's point about paper trading versus physical delivery is where the real mind-bending stuff happens. As I mentioned, less than 2% of these contracts ever result in a physical delivery. If you are a trader sitting in an office in New York or London, the last thing you want is a notification that 5,000 bushels of soybeans are being dumped on your front lawn because you forgot to close your position.
I can imagine the look on the neighbors' faces. But if no one is taking delivery, what is the point? If it is just people passing paper back and forth, does it actually help the farmer in Nebraska or the processor in Brazil? That is miles away from the American Midwest or the Brazilian Highlands. How does a shipping bottleneck in the Middle East end up reflected in the price of a soybean contract on the Chicago Board of Trade?
If a farmer knows his cost of production is $10 a bushel, and the futures market is offering $12 for delivery in November, he can sell a contract now and lock in that $2 profit. He has hedged his risk. On the other side of that trade might be a speculator who thinks the price will go to $15. The speculator provides the liquidity that allows the farmer to sleep at night. Then you have the trade truce between the US and China. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans, and they have been pivoting hard toward Brazil lately. Brazilian exports to China surged 80% year on year in early 26. So, if you are a trader in Chicago, you are not just looking at the weather in Iowa, you are looking at the diplomatic relationship between Washington and Beijing and the shipping lanes in the Middle East.
It sounds like a full-time job just to keep track of the variables. Speaking of variables, I know you have been following the Federal Reserve closely. Jerome Powell made some comments recently about stalled inflation progress. How does that feed into this? If the Fed stays hawkish and keeps the dollar strong, what does that do to a farmer in Illinois trying to sell his crop?
You are effectively capturing the volatility without ever needing a shovel. If the dollar stays high because Powell is worried about inflation, China is going to keep looking at Brazil or Argentina for their supply. It puts downward pressure on the price at the Chicago Board of Trade. This is why we saw that 5.7% drop a week ago. The market was pricing in a dollar that was just too strong for global buyers to stomach.
We did a deep dive on how oil derivatives run the world back in episode 1426, and it sounds like there are a lot of parallels here. In both cases, the paper market is actually what discovers the price that everyone else has to pay at the pump or the grocery store. But with soybeans, there is this extra layer called the crush spread. You mentioned a record, February crush from the National Oilseed Processors Association. What does that actually mean for the market?
The crush is where the rubber meets the road. It is the process of taking a raw soybean and turning it into soybean meal for animal feed and soybean oil for food or fuel. The crush spread is the difference between the cost of the raw beans and the value of those two finished products. Leverage is the primary aphrodisiac of the commodity world. In the stock market, if you want to buy $10,000 worth of shares, you usually need $10,000 or maybe $5,000 if you are trading on margin. In commodities, the margin requirements are often as low as 5 to 10%. That means with $1,000, you can control a soybean contract worth $20,000. If the price of soybeans moves up by 5%, you have doubled your money.
And if it moves down by 5%, you have lost everything and probably owe the broker more. It sounds like a great way to lose your shirt if you're not careful. These commodity exchanges are really just the original prediction markets. They are the world's way of trying to figure out what a calorie will be worth 6 months from now.
When the dollar loses purchasing power, the price of tangible things like beans and corn tends to rise. Plus, they are a non-correlated asset class. If the tech sector is crashing because of some regulatory shift, it does not necessarily mean that people are going to stop eating pork or that a drought in Brazil is going to magically end. Soybean prices move based on their own internal logic of weather and logistics.
Speaking of internal logic, let's look at what happened this month. You mentioned the Strait of Hormuz closure on March 17th. Now, for the uninitiated, why does a naval conflict in the Middle East affect the price of a soybean grown in Mato Grosso, Brazil, or Iowa? Where does a retail trader even begin to make sense of this without getting steamrolled by the institutional players?
A lot of the global fertilizer supply, or at least the energy required to produce it, flows through that region. When the strait was closed due to the ongoing Iranian conflict, the markets immediately began pricing in a massive spike in production costs. If it costs more to grow the bean, the future price of that bean has to rise to keep the farmer in business. We saw massive volatility in the grain complex that week.
And just a week before that, on March 10th, we had the WASDE report. That is the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates from the USDA. I love how the markets treat this report like it is a holy text being handed down from the mountain. Without the speculators, the farmer has no one to sell his risk to.
But they raised the season average price for soy meal by $5, taking it to $300 per ton. The reason was strong domestic livestock demand. Even with the geopolitical chaos, people in the U.S. are still eating a lot of meat, and those animals need soy meal. It shows that even when the global picture is messy, local demand can provide a floor for prices. Usually, that is a speculator who is willing to take on that price risk in exchange for the potential profit. It is a vital service, even if it looks like just moving numbers around on a screen.
It sounds like a nightmare for traders to navigate.
It has been a total mess. The goal is noble. They want to ensure that the soybean imported into Europe isn't coming from land that was recently deforested, but the implementation has been delayed over and over again. This creates a regulatory muddle where traders do not know what the compliance costs will be in 6 months. When there is uncertainty, traders hedge by buying more futures, which drives up the price for everyone. We could see a situation where there is plenty of food in the world, but it is all in the wrong places because it is too expensive to move. That kind of fragmentation is what leads to real price spikes at the grocery store.
It really brings home the idea that commodities are the bedrock. We get distracted by the latest tech IPO or whatever is happening in the crypto world, but at the end of the day, you can't eat a line of code. You need the beans. And seeing how the market handles these geopolitical shocks is a masterclass in how the world actually functions.
It really is. And for those who are interested in the technical side, I highly recommend looking into the historical context of the Chicago Board of Trade. It was founded in 1848 to standardize grain contracts because the influx of produce from the Midwest was so massive that the old system of individual deals just couldn't handle it. They standardized the contracts by 1865, and that was the birth of the modern world as we know it. It allowed for the massive scaling of agriculture that supports 8 billion people today.
It is amazing how much of our modern financial world was built just to make sure we had enough corn and wheat to get through the winter. It makes you realize that while the tools have changed, the fundamental human needs have not. We are still just trying to manage the uncertainty of the future.
We are, and we are doing it with more data than ever before. But even with all the satellites and high-frequency trading algorithms, a single frost in the wrong part of Brazil or a single diplomatic tweet can still send the whole thing into a tailspin. That is the beauty and the terror of commodity trading. It is the most honest market in the world because it is tied to physical reality.
I think that is a great place to wrap this up. We have covered a lot of ground today, from 17th century Japan to the biofuel demand of 2026. If you want to dig deeper into how these kinds of derivative markets work in other sectors, I definitely recommend checking out our episode on oil derivatives, episode 1426. It gives a lot of the foundational context that we touched on today.
And if you are interested in the broader idea of how markets function as information systems, episode 1432 on prediction markets is a great companion piece. It really helps you understand why these prices matter so much beyond just the profit and loss of a single trader.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping us on track. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to process all this data.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of soybean futures and global trade, we would love it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps other people find the show and join the conversation.
We'll be back soon with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep an eye on those charts, but maybe keep an eye on the weather too.
Goodbye for now.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts that keep